rental assistant, any jobs, any food. And I know I mentioned this to you, but I want to let my colleagues know, we're seeing families across the city in every ward that don't speak the language that we are serving. We're not going to turn them away. Our office is in the ward. It's been pretty difficult, so I'm hoping that there's a category that's more for communication. And this is barriers not just in the city, but any organization that we've allocated funds that distribute for rental assistance or any COVID-impacted services. So that's one. And another thing is I've worked in healthcare for many years, and another thing that I'm seeing is I am witnessing the mental health impact of the COVID of our families. I'm just wondering, as far as allocation for mental health, are we going to partner with CMSD school for maybe mental health counseling for those children and families that have been impacted, and or even counseling services across the city? So those are the two things in addition to what Councilman Griffin has mentioned. And of course, I've already submitted the proposals for allocations for special catalytic projects. One of them I want to say that it's going to create many jobs is the Northern Ohio blanket mills. So I want to make sure that that is a priority within the Action Recovery dollars.
Great.
So I would say that's it for me.
Okay, well, thank you, Councilwoman.
Thank you.
Councilman Mike Plensick.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, my honorable colleagues, and the viewing public. I would concur, Mr. President, with some of the areas that you've outlined. But one of the things I wanted to get across to my colleagues, I don't think we can really talk about these dollars segregated away from the general fund. We know that there's a cash balance right now within the general fund. As a result of reimbursements that we've received. So we can free up other dollars when we allocate the ARPA funds. We can free up other dollars. So that's why I think it's critical for the finance director to be at this table so we can really understand, dovetailing off Councilman Griffin's comments, we need to really understand what our cash balance is right now as we move forward. And as we look at these funds, and again, I would concur, we've got to make sure that we do not put ourselves in a situation that we have to fund positions that we don't have the money for after a 3-year period of time. So this is a very unique opportunity for us, one that I've never experienced in my time here, my tenure at City Council. I looked at the list that I put together based on what I've been hearing at neighborhood meetings, and I've been hearing it at my neighborhood meetings. I've been getting phone calls. I've received a few emails, and run into city employees. Like I ran into some folks, some firefighters the other day at Memorial Elementary School, indicated, look at the condition of our fire trucks. Look at the condition of these vehicles. I've heard it from EMS workers as well about the condition of EMS trucks as well. So again, I don't think we can do this isolated from the general fund and the enterprise accounts. I'd like to understand as we move forward the exact amount of cash we have at hand, and then how do these ARPA dollars that we have, how can we integrate those? Obviously, over the weekend, I received 5 calls out of the Glenville community about abandoned houses that have been sitting there forever and cannot understand why they've been sitting there for this long period of time. They want them removed, and I concur with them. So, Mr. Chairman, I'm on board to start to identify. We've already identified $5 million for the Greater Food Bank, and again, I would follow up on Blaine's comments. We need to look at that. Maybe there needs to be some additional funding committed to that for specific purposes out in our communities. But I do want to say this as well. There better be a game plan for the middle neighborhoods, because the mayor's neighborhood transformation plan went around Cleveland Clinic, UH, and Metro. That's where the $65 million went. The middle neighborhoods were excluded from that. So there is not a neighborhood that I'm aware of, Mr. Chairman and my honorable colleagues, that has not been impacted by COVID-19. If there is, please tell me, because I've got businesses that have closed. I have people that are out of work, people who've had their hours cut back. I'm still dealing with situations where businesses are ready to fold up as a result of the pandemic. So I just want to make it clear that whatever we do has to be holistic, has to be inclusive, and cannot say Well, no, this neighborhood is excluded for what reason or another. I want to see whatever action we take, Mr. Chairman. Again, I've listed all what I thought to be the priorities based on what I've received. I want to see inclusive, transparency. I want to see no section of the city excluded. And I'm ready to start assigning dollar amounts to some of these categories that you've outlined. Demolition. Let's get moving on it. We got a major problem out here. Demolition slowed down substantially during the pandemic, substantially slowed down. So I'm ready to apply some dollars right now toward demolition so we can get going. I'm ready to apply some dollars right now for the lead paint program, lead abatement program, which I'm hearing. Because again, like North Glenville was excluded from it. The entire North Glenville, north of Superior, was excluded from the program. So, I mean, those are issues that I have concern, and as we've heard, Councilman Griffin mentioned, we were promised 1,100 safety and security cameras. I don't know how many of those have gone up, and there's been dispute around this table, Mr. Chairman, as to where those cameras actually went, the ones that did go up. So I'm prepared to get going. We are approaching the end of August already. I know other cities have allocated dollar amounts already, funding. I've been following what's going on in the city of Akron. So I'm prepared to work with my colleagues, Mr. Chairman, my colleagues. Let's figure out how we can identify some very critical areas right now, working with the finance director, and let's start targeting monies right now in the mechanics of how we're going to achieve it. If we put several more $1 million into demolition, do we have the capabilities to do that right now? Do we have the capability to bring on the demolition contractors to do it? I want to have that assurances. It's one thing to assign dollar amounts, but if we can't get the end product, then it doesn't do us any good. I want to see, do we have the capability to fulfill the end product? We know with the food bank, which is a given, because they're ready to go, they're already putting up the new building, they just need a financial support and backing. But some of these other areas, broadband, I've heard from some of the people who are promoting the broadband. Why not wait until there's a new administration in place to see what their game plan is? I don't know if that's the route to go. Some of these other categories as well, because I've heard, and Mr. Chairman, you could have karma, there's some people talking about setting up a separate utility for broadband in the city. I don't know if that's the route to go. Maybe it is the route to go. But I'd like to learn more, and I'd like to have some experts advising us at the table as to, this is the way you should go, or you shouldn't go this way. Because I want these dollars. I want to say this again. We need to be penny wise and not pound foolish with these dollars, because we're never going to have this amount of money again. So whatever action we take, Mr. Chairman, it's got to have long-lasting impact. We have to see it. It really has to materialize in the streets so our citizens can see it, so they see the end results, because so often they don't see the end results of actions that have been taken around here. And again, based on my phone calls over the weekend about these abandoned homes, how do you explain to a citizen that they've had to look in an abandoned house for 8 years across the street from them? How do you explain it? I can't explain it to them. I can't figure out why. 8 years sitting there in a Glenville community. So again, I'm here to participate. I'm here to pull up my sleeves. But we need to have Sharon at the table.
I've said before,
Yeah.
she offered to be here,
Yeah.
but many
Yeah.
of our members wanted this to be a council discussion.
No,
so
I
so
appreciate
she's
that.
available upon request.
But we need to understand the
she's here.
issue
She's all in.
with surplus, because that frees up additional dollars for us. If we use, let's just take, okay, if we use ARPA funds for EMS vehicles to bring on some additional EMS, but then that frees up other monies that we have
Because of
set
the capital,
aside for
right.
EMS. So there's a domino effect here. It's basic physics. For every action, there's a reaction. So I think we need to look at that big picture. And if we look at that big picture, I think we're going to be much better off, and we're going to make sounder decisions. So that's what I'm here for. I want to make sound decisions, and I want to see a consensus around the table. These are the projects that we need to get going right now. There's some things we can't get going right now. I think, again, educate me, if we wanted to do citywide broadband tomorrow, we couldn't do it. There's a process that we have to enact. But we know we could start demolition. We know we could start ramping up some demolition. We know we could put some additional monies in the senior housing program, the home repair program. We know we could do that. So all I'm saying, let's figure out what's the low-hanging fruit right now and try to target some monies toward those areas and get those going. And then some other issues that are going to be much more difficult to deal with or more mechanics involved in that process. The lead paint program, Mr. Chairman, and I would say to Blaine, are we geared up? If we were to put additional funds in, are we ready to go? Do we have the capability to do that?
Yes.
Could we expand the geographical area?
Yes.
We could. Well then, see, those are the things that we need to know at the table, and I'm prepared to do whatever I have to do to work with my colleagues, you, Mr. Chairman, and all of us, to get these dollars out into our neighborhoods so we can start making a significant difference. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councilman. And you know that we did do the initial $1 million to the loan loss reserve for the Middle Neighborhoods Fund, and that's out the door. Councilwoman Jenny Spencer.
Thank you, Mr. Council President. I think we all agree. I'm really glad that this subsequent conversation is convening today. That there's going to be a balance between strategizing and deliberation versus the need to get going. Councilman Polensek just spoke about getting going. So I have a couple of questions for leadership around how do we actually see, just kind of to level set this process, just to understand, do we anticipate, I'm not being suggestive, but as a question, do we anticipate meeting every 2 weeks? Or what does the actual process look like to keep us in that space where we can both strategize and deliberate and yet begin to allocate funds? So, as one example, so today we're kind of talking big picture, but we've already begun allocations. So we know that we already allocated the $5 million to the food bank. We know that last week there was Ordinance 691, 2021, which was in relation to broadband. So I would rather know up front about legislation that's coming and allocations that are coming. And so in other words, what do we envision this process looking like for the body? And then how are we going to strike that balance between strategy and deliberation as compared to beginning to get funds out the door? What does leadership envision?
So what it's going to look like is we will meet as needed, as people feel the need to. It is summer schedule. Sometimes it's hard to bring people together in the summer, and talk about what are the broad categories. And today's intent is really to look at what are our citywide priorities. What are those big items that need to happen. From there, everything that needs to happen, you mentioned food bank, you mentioned broadband, everything that goes out needs to go through the legislative process. We can't just approve blanket category spending. So everything, let's just say it's demolition. We all agree that it's demolition and blight removal. From there, we need to pick a number that's based on number of structures we want removed, and we need to authorize that money to go out to contract. So it's really just in addition to what we do ahead of time before legislation is drafted, everything will go through the full committee process and be voted on, and there'll be no shortage of opportunities for people to opine on what their priorities are.
Thanks. And I think just as a follow-up, I think that Councilman Griffin asked some great questions today about how do we really start putting meat on the bones in terms of actually budgeting, actually getting numbers. What does the money get us? So if we're talking demolition or lead, what are we getting for X amount of dollars? So how do we begin to activate that process to do the research that we need to make those decisions? Similarly, Councilman Griffin brought up, I think broadband is one I think everyone has a lot of interest in and sees the importance of. It hadn't occurred to me until Councilman Griffin raised it. Is that an infrastructure bill spend or is that an ARPA spend? So how do we begin to get the data and information we need to actually make the decisions?
So again, it's lead, for example. There's a whole coalition of people that are pretty much expert on this issue.
Right.
And we can find, I think we could quickly task them to find that out. Demolition is something where it's, you know, the cost per homes is fairly consistent. Correct me if I'm wrong, Tony. For homes, they all fall within a certain dollar amount. So I don't think that's going to be as hard to quantify. I think the biggest thing we do is, decide what are our priorities. What is important to this body? What's important to council to move forward, and then we figure out the path. But I think the hardest part is going to be prioritizing and deciding on the priorities. Coming up with, let's say we want to take down 4,000 vacant abandoned homes that are, queued up and ready to go. You multiply that by 10,000, and there's going to be a little bit of cushion, somebody up above and beyond. So that part I don't think is going to be as challenging. It's not going to be simple, but right now we are just solely in the prioritization phase. But all that, there's a path for all of that. That I think will be, again, I think this is going to be the hardest part. I think, figuring out what the dollar amount is, the appropriate dollar amount, appropriating that, this is going to be the most important part right now.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I think, demolition, I don't disagree that the math is somewhat simple, but then I think it's an interesting question of if we throw more dollars at it, is there capacity on the demolition contractor side to get it out the door, to get it actually providing relief in our neighborhoods? So, whether that's our council research staff or, like you said, coalition members in the case of lead, I would just, I think that that information will be welcome. So, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Councilman Mooney?
Can you hear me, Mr. Chairman? Okay,
Yes.
Thank you. I'll just keep this brief because I saw a lot of what I submitted on these sheets isn't permissible for this type of funding. But I like a lot of the ideas I've heard. Just one quick question, then I have a comment. Am I right to understand that you heard that these the high-resolution police cameras, this is permissible spending? Is that right, Mr. Chairman?
I do not have the answer to that specific question, but to the extent that crime has increased during COVID, there's certainly a plausible nexus between the two.
Okay, so we don't know if we can do that.
Not
Okay.
for certain, but I'm
All right.
confident.
All right, well, I guess the one thing I just want to mention that I haven't heard yet that I drew out last week is we can spend this money in parks, playgrounds, ball fields, basketball courts, and that is a permissible use that I saw the Department of Treasury and Sharon confirmed for us. So, this could be spent on our parks, our recreation centers, baseball fields, football fields, and those are a lot of big ticket items. And when I mentioned, some of these things, I know we have some plans, might be smart to do that, not just for the good it will do, but because it would free up other monies. And, if we spend money on ambulances per se or this stuff, it frees up different types of dollars that gives us more freedom to do the things that a lot of us really would like to do but can't do with these funds. And those are the quality of life issues that Councilman Plensick was talking about, because it's hard to explain to my residents why there are dead trees that I can't get cut down in the city, why there's not a single dollar allocated to take care of our brick roads. Things like that I just don't have a logical answer for them, other than the city doesn't have the money. But now if we do have the opportunity to get caught up, like I said, like those ambulances where we have some with almost 400,000 miles and fire equipment that's really poor, I think we have to look at this globally, not just where this money goes, but the impact that we have if we free up other funds globally, like Councilman Plensick said, on other priorities we have. But this is a good start, so thank you.
Thank you so much. Councilman Bercatelli?
Yes, thank you, Mr. President, and thank you for getting together. And when I look at the original legislation that we passed, 303-2021, I think at that time we'd already allocated $79 million as part of our reimbursement, so that's already been pulled out of that structure of the first $200 million.
Could you repeat that?
It was $79 million out of the first half. We'll need to confirm with the finance director, but I think that's what we had authorized. And as we looked through the recommendations that a number of council members had put together, as John James had put these out on what each council person had as priorities. And I appreciate now that we have, I know I passed around the appendix of what's eligible. You can kind of mirror over those eligibilities to see how that fits. And some of these, as Councilman stated, may not be eligible. But when you look at these broader categories, I know blight elimination really has rung across all of our wards. And it really hits a number of the categories you already spoke on. One around lead remediation. Demolition removes those environmentally toxic properties. Safety, it helps, we know that doing demolition helps make our neighborhood safer. It also helps stabilize. When we talk about equity, neighborhoods that have been hit hard with abandoned properties, it really helps create more, stabilizes the wealth of the property that you already own, that you're living in, and eliminating that property next door adds value to your property. So you can go on and on about the different categories that hits, but I think the broader category, quite frankly, is housing. And I think blight elimination falls under housing because from that, you're creating opportunities. When you look at some of the scattered site programs that we've done through Cleveland Housing Network, when you look at being able to do infill, one of the most sustainable things you can do is build on existing housing lots, tying into our infrastructure that we already have. I think you start looking at stabilizing families. You're not getting that churn of families moving from neighborhood to neighborhood. You make them more stable in food security because they can find local connections of where they stay within a neighborhood, raise their family. It's, clearly, the P16 initiative that's being done through Third Federal Foundation and the folks in Southwick Village show that stabilizing families helps stabilize education outcomes from our families and the children in our families, and being able to isolate and find some of the demands and the needs that they have. So under the broad housing category, when we look at some of the projects that we've done recently where we've underwritten new housing construction, if you think about a $180,000 home that you can underwrite $40,000 to bridge that gap of appraisal, you are now driving that price down to about $700 a month for a family to live in a brand new home. You can do thousands of new homes under that structure on these vacant lots throughout our city. We have a very robust land bank, both the city land bank as well as the county land bank. So you can really start infilling and creating housing opportunities, moving our population numbers up. When you look at our occupancy numbers and start eliminating the blighted ones, building new housing, doing infill, you stabilize neighborhoods. And it also hits some of the economic development numbers. When you talk about, the basic premise of putting fannies in the seat, when you start putting people in these homes, you start creating shoppers, disposable income that's going into the local small economies. You can really see those opportunities growing over time. And we've seen that through the Mayor's Neighborhood Transformation Plan. When you concentrate resources in a particular neighborhood, you're going to see that in Metro. The Fast 50 that was just done, and now with the Neighborhood Transformation Plan dollars coming in, that you stabilize block by block. You can really, through a strategic approach, you can make a significant impact pretty quickly. I think we've mentioned it earlier that, and at our last meeting with Chief Dumas, there are other categories that are coming in that aren't coming from our pool, like the rental and utility assistance that just came in. I think it was $13 million that we're going to put out. We have to be mindful. I know Councilwoman Spencer talked a little bit about the infrastructure bill that doesn't come into this, but it is what we're looking for in terms of improving our infrastructure and our streets. We know it hits our lower economy much harder because the cost of repairing your cars on some of these streets is adding value to these families. When you start eliminating that $500 to $1,000 a year extra that you're spending maintaining your car off of some of our streets. So those larger categories around housing, infrastructure, really help around a number of the other categories that we're talking about. And I think every councilman has mentioned around improving our city facilities. Out of the pandemic, there's been this new awakening around our rec centers, our green space, our parks. We talk about creating and adding additional trails so that we have a lot of equity on the east side of having trails that can bring us downtown, that you see an amazing trail infrastructure on the west side. I think all those categories really add value, add equity to our homes. So they're big lump sum categories. And then how we break that down, as you stated, Council President, is what the decisions are going to be made as we go on to additional meetings. But that's our role now, is to create those big lump sum categories, have a lot of subcategories under them. So when we go in at the end of August and start going to the federal government saying, here are the pools of how we want to use them, they're pretty big pools, but there's a lot of categories underneath them. And I think that's that level of detail as we work diligently through our plan for our Cleveland Economic Rescue Plan will be fleshed out. I think there's a lot of good information already out there. I know James has been collecting from all of us, so this is a first great step in that.
Okay, thank you. Councilman Brian Casey.
Thank you, Mr. President. One thing I want to touch on is I believe that before we start spending money, we need to have a much broader plan before we create different problems. And I just want to use one example that everybody keeps talking about is demolition. And in my opinion, Mr. President, before we start tearing down 4,000 new structures, we need to have a plan in place for what we're going to do with those structures. I mean, we've all sat here and complained about illegal dumping, and are we just creating, more of a problem? And then are we creating a problem in, Parks and Rec who have to maintain them? So I think before we start, spending a lot of these dollars on big projects, we need to make sure that those projects are also sustainable. And that we're not creating more of a problem for another department within the city. Also, I'd like to see dollars allocated for streets. And I know that the mayor has done, and the administration, along with the council, has done a really good job with worst to first in streets. However, I think we need to start also looking at that in a more neighborhood-driven form. For example, instead of just doing, a worse street here or a worse street here or a worse street here, we should probably take C, D, and F streets that are next to each other and start doing streets that are closer to one another. So this way it impacts more, you're still doing a street, but it impacts more of a neighborhood when you do 3 or 4 or 5 streets in a row. As opposed to, we know that streets will last us 20 years. So aside from Councilman Polensek, I don't think any of us will be here in 20 years. So that makes more of an impact on neighborhoods. Even though it's not the whole ward, it impacts a lot more travelers. And then the last thing is I want to touch on, and I know Councilman Griffin mentioned it with Neighborhood Progress, Inc., when they came up with their recommendations. And one thing they mentioned in there was the legacy shopping centers. We have a lot of these shopping centers around the city that were built in the 60s and 70s. And I know you have a couple in your ward, I have a couple in my ward, that look like they're still sitting in the 60s and 70s, right? And a lot of these owners are not local, right? They've taken off on us, but they continue to stay filled in some cases, so there's no incentive for these owners of these legacy shopping centers to reinvest because they're still collecting their rents even though these buildings have been paid off or these plazas have been paid off. So there's really no incentive. So, if we could come up with some sort of an incentive for, improving these legacy shopping centers, and I just love the term legacy shopping centers that have, exactly, yeah. We'd love to bring a legacy village to every one of our wards. But that, those legacy shopping centers, sometimes, as Councilman Griffin just redid Buckeye, right? So we know that they're a catalyst for a lot of neighborhoods, right? They're create jobs, there's shopping that gets done there, keeps money locally in the economy, and it helps sustain neighborhoods. So we need, we should look into some program for these legacy shopping centers. But whatever we do, Mr. President, I would hope that, and Councilman Polensek keeps mentioning it, that it's just not going to be a fly-by-night, that we need to make sure that any dollar spent is a sustainable dollar, right? And it's something that makes an impact not only across the city of Cleveland, but even more locally in these wards, especially the neighborhoods that don't receive a lot of, investment from the city, and we've got to go out and get our own private, investors and stuff like that. But, this is a great opportunity for the city. I look forward to a lot further, much further conversations at these. And again, demolition, I just, I don't want to take care of one problem to create another one. The streets with the long-term sustainability and the legacy shopping centers. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Councilman. And Councilman Griffin has a follow-up, but I want to just comment on something you said about making sure that we've got a plan in place for this. And going back to what Councilman Brancatelli said, I think that thinking about the broad category instead of being demo should be housing, because so many things fall under that. And I guess the things that we can do to encourage new development on those lots is what really can build neighborhood wealth and really kind of bring these things back. So I think in terms of, I agree with you, you're correct in terms of needing a plan, but I think this fits into, I think I've been thinking about this kind of wrong, I'm thinking just demo and blight elimination when you think about housing as its own category, and those are subcategories underneath it. Councilman Griffin, you want to follow up?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. These questions are more around process, and I know that we have to be very deliberate, and I'm one of those that really believe that we have to be very, very strategic in how we approach these dollars. But what if there were 5 things, 5 critical categories that this council came together and agreed upon and had hard numbers to do? How soon and how fast can we act on that? I mean, we know that there's a sense of urgency in the city of Cleveland to address some of these issues. So from a process standpoint, and I know that Director Dumas or Chief Dumas is not here to give us an answer, but from a process standpoint, what if this council agreed on broadband investment in lead, making lead-safe homes and housing stabilization, investments in blight and those things, investments in critical catalytic projects, and investments in some of the other things that we talked about around safety. What if we did have 5 things we agreed upon? How and what could we do to try to move those projects along and not wait?
I mean, we can authorize, if people wanted to really roll up their sleeves and spend 24/7 getting this done, we can authorize this quickly. But as we talked about, just demo, for example, make sure there's contractors that are ready to go. We know for our senior housing services, it wasn't an issue of money as much as it was getting projects queued up, contractors identified and out the door. So we can authorize very quickly. How quickly it be spent, that would be a question that we need to ask of the administration.
So, Mr. Chair, I'm thinking just in process that as this council has some priorities, and I'm not sure if we have a staff person that's assigned to this. I know that John James is here today, or if you were planning on maybe having somebody that we bring in to make sure that these dollars are done the way that we need to, that we accomplish our priorities on our side of the hall. It'd be very interesting to see if we could find a way to consensus build around 5 critical projects. I'm just throwing that number out there, 5 or 6, that this council can really gravitate to and say, this is where we want to make an investment and do the right thing for the citizens of the Cleveland now, that we know that we wouldn't get much pushback. Now, let's be honest, the 300, and I know that they said 372, but I tend to think it's 380,000. People of this city getting around the table to make a decision is going to be impossible. Every neighborhood has different needs and different scopes of what they believe that's important. But I believe that many of us around this table can come up with 5 or 6 critical categories that we can really say that this is where we think is a priority. So I'd like for us to think about that. And then one other thing that I did want to make sure that we looked at is, and I know people hate this term, but demonstration projects. There's a need to try to deal with speeding in this area. It's not going to get resolved just by cops, just by having police officers do more of those kind of stops and everything. But we need technology, and we know that we have a hard time, and this city, along with every city in the United States, is having a hard time with car chases. Well, there's technology that we can put in place to deal with car chases. And maybe those are one of the things that we look at trying to do a demonstration project before we go to full scale in order to deal with some of those things. Because as you said, I think that we've had an uptick, and maybe statistics will show that it's been an uptick in speeding because of COVID and some of these things have happened. I think to my colleague, once again, she has some great ideas, so, I want to attribute this to where it's from. My colleague, Jasmine Santana, continuously talks about having speed tables and speed bumps that we can actually look at doing some of these demonstration projects just to see if they have an appropriate outcome. So I'm saying this in two buckets. If there's 5 things that we can potentially agree upon as a council, we should look about how we can do it nimbly, how we can all say these are things that we all agree on and that we all, or at least can build some kind of resemblance of a consensus. And then number 2, really look in demonstration projects. So if we can actually look before we go to full scale, actually see if some of these things will work that can help us deal with some of these complex issues that we're dealing with, like police chases and speeding and infrastructure and street diets and those things.
Great. Thank you, Councilman. Councilwoman Gray.
All right. Thank you so much, Council President. I just want to say, I'm just reading over what former Phyllis Cleveland had left here, and it's basically the same that what everybody else said. I actually agree with everybody here said as council, because it happened in each of our wards of how this money needs to be spent. But I do agree with just Blaine just spoke about putting in the right categories. What is the main categories that we need to focus on? How much money we should spend in these categories. That's the focus, because in everybody's ward, we got something going on, especially in Ward 5 with me living there. Now I'm driving around the city basically every day and looking at the housing, the old house, the arson homes, the abandoned homes. I'm looking at the streets need to be paved. I'm listening to people talk about what they need in their community, and basically a lot of different things. They're looking at the internet. They're looking at, even I had a meeting with the fire department, Local 93. I sat with them. Their fire trucks are old. They got the oldest one, I guess, in the city here, up there on 79th, I think it is. They was telling me about. They need that, and I'm listening to what everybody's saying, and I basically agree. But we need to figure out what is the main ones, where's the money coming in, how the money's going to be divided, how it's going to be structured, how we going to spend it, because we all got a lot of things we need to do, a lot of things. So basically, I agree with everybody. I'm short-lived right here because I'm learning to go to know. But I do agree to how we need to set it up, and what's first, what's second, and what's third for all of us.
Great.
So that's basically it.
Okay, well, thank you. No, I appreciate that. Councilman Brackett, you had a follow-up?
Yeah, thank you. And I think following up on Councilman Gray's point, there are catalytic projects in every area. I think about in her ward, University Settlement, and their Rising project. It's an amazing project that impacts not just her ward, but all the surrounding wards in terms of providing food and health services. And that project's a catalytic project for our region. So, when I look at individual projects like University Settlement, but I also look at the citywide projects. For instance, we're working on the police headquarters, which continues to rise in cost, as well as the potential training center, which doesn't have a budget right now at all, other than a small dollar amount, but not enough to build that out. I think a training center for our safety forces really hits the category around COVID response and training, which is critically important. I think those public facility dollars are going to be a larger, and you put everything under that, under public facilities. You can put the rec centers and the fire stations and the equipment and so on. So I think those categories get bigger as we go on, but I think they're important that we have the larger ones and then bring the categories underneath it. So thank you.
Thank you, Councilman. Councilwoman Santana?
Thank you, Mr. President. I'll be brief. So I just want to follow up on Councilman Griffin's comment about coming up with 5 top priorities, which I think is a great idea. But my question would be, I think transformational projects means something different to each of us. So when we're talking about demolition, right, is that something that's going to help bring our residents out of poverty? Are we thinking that way? And so in identifying the top projects, because I want to start thinking about that, what would really transform our city and move it forward? Is it demolition? When we talk about safety, does it make sense to add more police officers, or are we talking about investing in the deep-rooted issues that are affecting our youth, right? You know, creating those vulnerable places for youth to come together, or job creation. So can we have possibly a template that we're continually asking ourselves a question of, do these projects meet the, I would say, the
Criteria.
the criteria of
Sure.
how you move a city forward. And I don't know, and maybe the administration could help us with that, but, I mean, I could come up with top 5, but I would need help to really identify if they're transformational projects.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. Yeah, we can certainly come up with a template, a working document that we can be continually working on.
Until that we could get our goals and then like our objectives
Absolutely.
for it.
Absolutely. Councilwoman?
Thank you. Following up on Councilman Santana's comment about criteria, I know, again, we have to remember that we have to go back to what is an allowed expense by the federal government, and so just making sure that council remains grounded. I mean, I really love the idea of, we've talked about speed tables as an example many times, police chases, all those kinds of matters. Can we go back and match that to allowable uses for these dollars? So I think it's both, and I think it's prioritization and then ensuring that any priorities match back to the allowable uses. And so, yeah, that's just a question in my mind as we're continuing to raise important topics.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you. So, John, you've been taking good notes of what we're doing. Okay, so you and I will get together after this and just kind of compare notes, because I took my own, and we'll continue to have these discussions and just kind of keep pushing this forward, and I'll share our documents with the administration as well, and we'll just kind of keep things moving forward. But again, this is really an historic opportunity for this council to really dig into some vexing, difficult issues and really try to get a solution. So thank you all for your time. Do you have a
Just a
Sure.
quick miscellaneous, if I may.
Sure, of course.
There's a swing set that's missing. No, just kidding. Not to give the staff more work, but the population numbers that were released, I know they're starting to drill down on some of those.
Okay.
And at some point, I'd like to have that discussion. We'll come back at DPS and have a presentation around our population.
Yep.
One of the things I need to look at is there an opportunity to challenge the number for the city of Cleveland? I mean, we're a few thousand away. There has been challenges around because the response rate for Cleveland was pretty low. I think it was 50% or just under.
Yeah.
And so a lot of the numbers are estimated based on data mining, that we can move that number up just a little bit. A couple thousand folks will make a difference on that. So
Yeah.
I'll circle back with you.
Yeah, please.
Mr. Chairman.
I don't know what the answer to that is, so yeah, we'll find
Okay.
out though.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks. Mike, Council Ponce?
Yeah, yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chairman, I just wonder if we could get the most recent update from Sharon as it pertains to dollars that we have received. I
Sure.
would just like to get an update.
Yep.
The monies that we have received from day one as it pertains and how those dollars have been spent, because again, it's going to help us get a better understanding of where we need to direct resources to, so that would be very helpful. Thank you very much.
Absolutely, thank you. Okay, anything else for the good of the order? Yes, please.
Can we get notified of this meeting at least a week in advance?
Maybe not a
Please.
full week,
Okay, 3 days, we would be good probably with that.
but you can kind of plan on Mondays generally, but yeah, we don't get much full week in advance notice, so. All right, thank you, everybody. We are adjourned. I guess I need to hit this one.
Kinsman. And, Kinsman was an East Side neighborhood